What if I told you that one of the primary leaders of the First Crusade was a man who didn't care about Jerusalem at all? While Godfrey of Bouillon was selling his castles in the name of redemption, while thousands of fanatics were marching to die for the faith, he watched this chaos with a cold smirk. His name was Bohemond of Taranto. He was the son of the greatest adventurer of his time, Robert Guiscard, the conqueror of southern Italy. Raised on war, Bohemond breathed it. However, there was one problem. He remained the eternal second son. His father left all his lands and titles to his half-brother. Bohemond, a born conqueror, ended up with nothing. He spent years in desperate attempts to claw out a patch of land for himself, fighting against the Byzantine Empire in the Balkans, but he met with failure. And then, in 1096, as he was already approaching 40, Pope Urban II announced the Crusade. To Godfrey, this looked like a path to redemption. To Bohemond, it presented itself as a final chance, an adventure that would either make him a king or kill him. This is the story of the most cynical, the most cunning, and perhaps the most brilliant strategist of the Crusade. Today, you will learn, why was this brilliant warrior, the son of a conqueror, stripped of his inheritance? How exactly did he manage to single-handedly wrap all the leaders of the Crusade around his finger and force them to swear to give him the greatest trophy? Why, when the army moved toward the main objective, toward Jerusalem, was Bohemond the only one who refused to go? How did this invincible tactician manage to walk into an ambush and spend 3 years in Muslim captivity? And what forced him to assemble another crusade, which ended in the greatest humiliation of his life? This is not a story about faith. This is a story about naked, uncovered ambition. This is a psychological portrait of a man who saw the crusade not as a divine mission, but the perfect instrument for seizing power. And he almost succeeded. To understand Bohemond, you need to understand his father. He was Robert Guiscard, the Cunning, or the Fox, a Norman mercenary who, through sheer force and treachery, carved out a duchy for himself in southern Italy, challenging both the Byzantine and Holy Roman empires. Bohemond was considered his firstborn. Likely, when looking in the mirror, he saw his father. Being a giant for his time, a brilliant tactician, a born leader, he had no doubt that he would inherit Guiscard's empire. He was being groomed to rule. But in reality, he served only as a tool in his father's hands. When Guiscard needed a political alliance, he divorced Bohemond's mother and married another. And when his father died, all the lands, all the titles, and all the wealth went to Bohemond's half-brother, Roger Borsa, the son from the second, more profitable marriage. Roger was distinguished by weakness, indecisiveness, and sickliness. Bohemond, on the other hand, was known as a genius of war. But the law was on Roger's side. The fact is that his father's first marriage was annulled by the church on the grounds of close kinship. An adventurer, born to rule an empire, was left with one single city, Taranto. He had turned into a nobody. Here lies the first turning point, not the year 1096, but his entire preceding life. It was precisely this circumstance that formed his character. Let us transport ourselves to southern Italy, roughly the year 1090. All across Europe, young knights are fighting in tournaments or managing their lands. At this time in Italy, Bohemond is waging a desperate civil war against his own brother, trying to win back at least something of his father's legacy. He suffers failure. Then he, just like his father, attempts to conquer lands for himself in the Balkans by attacking the Byzantine Empire, and again, failure. He meets fierce resistance from Emperor Alexios Komnenos and is forced to retreat. We do not see a great prince, but a wolf cornered in a trap. He is pushing 40. He is at the peak of his powers, yet he has no kingdom and no future. Every one of his genius plans has failed. Now let's address his psychology. What does a genius feel who has been disinherited in favor of someone he considers a non-entity? Thirst. Not just a thirst for money or power, a thirst to prove to the ghost of his father, to prove to the whole world that he, and not Roger, was the true heir of Guiscard. In this moment, in 1096, when he was once again unsuccessfully besieging some small Italian town, news arrives. Urban II is calling for a crusade. Thousands of knights see this as the will of God. Bohemond sees a loophole. He looks to the east not as the Holy Land. His gaze is turned toward the lands he had already tried to conquer, the lands of the Byzantine Empire. He lusts for the rich cities of Syria. He finds in the Crusade the perfect cover. This is a chance to gather an army, receive the blessing of the Church, and finally conquer for himself the kingdom that was taken from him by birthright. He immediately tears the cloak from his back, cuts it into crosses, and distributes them to his soldiers. His personal crusade had begun, but his goal was not Jerusalem. His goal became Antioch. Bohemond, the most experienced, the most cunning, and the most ambitious of all the leaders, joins the campaign. However, a problem arose. His old enemy, Emperor Alexios, whom he had tried to overthrow, now acted as their ally. Alexios was horrified to see Bohemond's army at the walls of Constantinople. He forced all the leaders of the crusade to swear an oath of allegiance to him, an oath that all conquered cities which previously belonged to Byzantium would be returned to him. Godfrey swore this oath reluctantly. Raymond of Toulouse argued for a long time, but agreed. But Bohemond, the Norman, gave it with a smile. After all, for his people, oaths were merely words that help buy time. He knew that the real game would begin at the walls of the city he had eyed for himself from the very beginning, the city that served as the key to the entire East, Antioch. The siege of this city would become a masterpiece of intrigue for Bohemond. It is here that he would wrap the Byzantine Emperor, the Turkish Emir, and, most importantly, all his Crusader allies around his finger. October 1097. The Crusader army is at the walls of Antioch. As is well known, this siege, which lasted 8 months, became a hell for the army. Famine, disease, despair. Godfrey of Bouillon opened his treasury and became the moral anchor of the campaign, saving it from collapse. Bohemond, the Prince of Taranto, was working during this time. He did not spend his resources on feeding other people's soldiers. He used this chaos to pull off the most audacious political scam of his life. His goal was not simply to storm the city. The task was to take this city for himself, violating the oath given to Emperor Alexios. To do this, he needed to solve 2 problems. First, the Byzantine overseer Tadakius, who was in the camp to accept the city in the name of the emperor. Second, the impregnable walls. And Bohemond solved them both. First, he pulled off a psychological operation. He secretly met with Tadakius and, pretending to be an ally, warned him. He said, "The other leaders are furious. They believe you are to blame for our failures and have conspired to kill you. Tarakias, representing the hated Byzantium, believed him. Fearing for his life, he fled the camp secretly in the night. Checkmate. The first piece is removed from the board. The Byzantine representative was no more. Now Bohemond could rightfully claim that the Byzantines had abandoned them themselves and broken the oath first. Now the walls remained. While Godfrey prayed and Ramon built siege engines, Bohemond looked for a traitor, and he found him. His name was Firouz, an Armenian renegade, a commander of one of the towers. Bohemond, likely through his spies, found this man, discovered that he held grievances against the city's emir, and offered him something he couldn't refuse: gold and safety. Here comes the second turning point. Bohemond possessed the key to the city, but he did not hurry. He waited. He waited for the moment when the gigantic army of Kerboga from Mosul was already approaching Antioch, when despair in the camp reached its peak, when the leaders were ready for anything. And then he struck his blow, but not against the walls, against his allies. He gathered the leaders and announced, "I know how to take the city, right now, but I will do it only if you all swear that the city will go to me." It was blackmail. The leaders were furious, especially Ramon of Toulouse. They reminded him of the oath to Emperor Alexios, but Bohemond remained implacable. "Either the city is mine, or we all die here under the walls at the hands of Kerboga." They had to swear. Let's assess the situation. This was not the act of a warrior. This was the move of a gambler. That very night, June 3, 1098, Bohemond's detachment secretly approached Firouz's tower. A ladder was lowered. His men burst into the city and opened the gates. While the army rushed into Antioch, unleashing a massacre, Bohemond immediately sent his personal standard to the highest citadel of the city. He did not just capture the city, he branded it. Having become the Prince of Antioch, he finally received what he came for. His personal crusade was over. Bohemond had seized his prize. Antioch was his. Let us recall that the Crusaders were immediately trapped. Kerboga's army besieged them inside the city. Through a miracle, largely thanks to the discovery of the Holy Lance, they managed to launch a sortie and defeat the Turks. The victory was shared, but Bohemond refused to share the trophy. Ramon of Toulouse flew into a rage. He demanded the city be given to Byzantium as they had sworn. Bohemond merely laughed in response, pointing out that the Byzantine representative Tarakias had cowardly fled. The Crusade stalled again for a whole 6 months. The princes argued over the spoils. And when, finally, under the pressure of the desperate soldiers, the army moved further in January 1099 towards Jerusalem, Bohemond stayed behind. He stood on the walls of his city and watched as the dusty column of pilgrims led by Godfrey and Ramon walked south towards the main shrine of Christianity. Jerusalem interested him no longer. He had found his own shrine, and now he had to hold on to it. January 199. The walls of Antioch. 7 long months had passed since Bohemond seized the city. For 7 months, the Crusader army sat in place, paralyzed by the dispute between him and Raymond of Toulouse. The common soldiers, who had walked for 3 years to liberate the Holy Sepulchre, were in despair. They hadn't signed up for the army so Bohemond could become a prince. Let's remember that they mutinied, threatening to march on Jerusalem themselves, with leaders or without. At that moment, the army moved. This became the third and perhaps the most important turning point in Bohemond's history, the moment when the masks were finally dropped. we see this scene. Disheveled, exhausted, but fanatically devoted to the idea, the army of pilgrims led by Godfrey and Raymond exits the gates of Antioch and turns south. Their final, most desperate forced march to Jerusalem awaits them. And on the walls of the city, in the rich robes of the Prince of Antioch, stands Bohemond of Taranto, and he watches them go. He does not go with them. Let's try to make sense of this choice. For Godfrey, refusing Jerusalem would have meant betraying everything for which he sold his lands. For Bohemond, going to Jerusalem would have been stupidity. He remained a pragmatist to the marrow of his bones. His personal crusade was finished the second his banner soared above the citadel of Antioch. Why did he need Jerusalem? Jerusalem served as a spiritual symbol, but it was distinguished by poverty. The city was located deep inland, cut off from the sea, in the heart of hostile lands. It was a logistical nightmare. Antioch, on the contrary, was considered one of the richest cities in the world. It represented a strategic hub, the key to Syria, the gateway to the Silk Road. It was the third most important patriarchate of the Christian world. Bohemond, stripped of his inheritance, had finally received what he had sought all his life. He received not just a city, he received a principality, that which his great father, Robert Guiscard, could not conquer. He looked at the departing army not as brothers in arms, he looked at them as fools walking to die for a relic, while he, Bohemond, had seized the treasure. He exchanged a spiritual mission for a very real crown. But this crown had a price. By staying in Antioch, he remained alone. He was surrounded by Turks who thirst for revenge. And, what was even worse, he was surrounded by the Byzantine Empire, which he had deceived and which would never forgive him for the theft of this city. He had achieved everything, but now he had to hold it. And his very first mistake, born of new pride, would prove fatal. The year 1099, while Godfrey is storming Jerusalem, Bohemond, the new prince of Antioch, is enjoying power. He got his kingdom, and, as one would expect from the son of Guiscard, he immediately begins to expand it. He is no longer the cunning fox, he is a lion. He considers himself invincible. He launches raids on neighboring Muslim cities, seizing loot and expanding borders. But he forgot the main rule his father knew. The lion often falls into traps set for foxes. In the summer of 1010, just a year after his triumph, Bohemond receives a call for help from the Armenian ruler of the city of Melitene. It turned out to be an ambush. The powerful Turkish emir Danishmend Gazi was already lying in wait for Bohemond. Bohemond, blinded by his new power, walks straight into the trap. He takes only a small detachment with him, confident that his name is enough to send enemies fleeing. But in the Battle of Melitene, his detachment was annihilated, and the great Bohemond himself, Prince of Antioch, the adventurer who deceived everyone, fell into captivity. The year 1001, the Battle of Melitene. When the dust settled, Bohemond's detachment was exterminated, and the great Prince of Antioch himself, the new Guiscard, the genius of intrigue, found himself in chains. He was taken prisoner by the Turkish emir Danishmend Gazi. For any other knight, this would have been a tragedy. For Bohemond, it turned into something worse. It was a humiliation. the man who had fought all his life not to be considered second, who had deceived the emperor and outplayed all the leaders of the Crusade, now sat in a filthy Turkish dungeon in Neo-Caesarea. The wolf, who thought himself smarter than everyone, had fallen into the simplest trap. Before us is the fourth turning point, his fall. Bohemond, a man of action, a man of control, found himself completely helpless. He was in captivity for 3 years. Let's look at what was happening in the world while he was in a cage. In Antioch, power was immediately picked up by his nephew, an equally ambitious and cunning Norman, Tancred of Taranto. Tancred became regent and continued Bohemond's policy. He fought against the Turks and furiously against Byzantium. In Constantinople, his old enemy, Emperor Alexios Komnenos, was delighted. His main enemy, who had stolen Antioch, was languishing in captivity. Alexios immediately offered Emir Danishmend a gigantic ransom for Bohemond in order to get him into his own dungeon. And here happens the greatest irony. Emir Danishmend refused the emperor. The Turkish emir turned out to be more cunning than both of them. He understood perfectly well, as long as Bohemond sits in his captivity, Tancred rules in Antioch, and Tancred hates Byzantium. If he sells Bohemond to Alexios, there is a chance that Bohemond will make a deal with the emperor, and Byzantium will regain Antioch. The great Bohemond, master of manipulation, had turned into a simple political pawn. He was held in captivity not so much for ransom, but to spite Byzantium. Imagine Bohemond's psychology. 3 years in a dungeon. He hears how his enemy, Emperor Alexios, is trying to buy him like a slave. He hears how the Turkish emir is bargaining for him. All his pride, all his thirst to be first, to be a conqueror, all of this was trampled. There was no humility in him as there would have been in Godfrey. Pure, concentrated rage accumulated in him. Rage at the Turks who caught him. Rage at his nephew Tancred, who felt too comfortable on his throne. And above all, an all-consuming hatred for Alexios Komnenos, whom he blamed for all his troubles. In 1103, he was finally ransomed, not by the emperor, but by his allies, the Crusaders led by Baldwin I of Jerusalem. He returned to Antioch. But this was no longer that cold and calculating player. A man emerged from captivity, possessed by a single idea: revenge. The year 1103. Bohemond returns to his throne in Antioch. He discovers that during his 3-year absence, Byzantium has recaptured several key cities from his principality. His army is weakened, his treasury is empty. He understands that he can no longer win in Syria. He needs a new, crushing blow. And he decides to strike it not against the Turks who held him captive, but against his main, existential enemy. He decides to destroy the Byzantine Empire. In 1104, he leaves Antioch in the care of Tancred and departs for Europe. But he does not travel as a petitioner. He travels as a living legend, as a hero of the Crusade. He tours the courts of France and Italy. He marries a French princess. He uses all his fame to gather a new crusade. The Pope gives him his blessing, thinking that Bohemond will lead the army to the east, to the aid of Jerusalem. However, Bohemond was hatching a different plan. In 1107, having gathered an army of 34,000, an army that in numbers was not inferior to the one that took Jerusalem, he lands in the Balkans. His goal is not Jerusalem and not Antioch. His goal is the Byzantine Empire. The year 1107. The Balkans. Bohemond, hero of the First Crusade, stands at the head of a new 34,000-strong army. He convinced the Pope and all of Europe that Byzantium is the main enemy hindering campaigns to the east. He brought an armada to repeat the feat of his father and seize the empire. His first target was the city of Dyrrhachium, the very same fortress that his father, Robert Guiscard, had once successfully captured. He likely reasoned like this: "I am Bohemond. I took Antioch. I will crush this too." He was at the peak of his hubris, driven by rage accumulated in Turkish captivity. But in reality, he was leading his army to the slaughter. And his opponent, Emperor Alexios Komnenos, was no longer the man he despised. Alexios, cunning, patient, and vengeful, had been waiting for this for 10 years. He knew Bohemond would return, and he was ready. Here it is, the fifth, final turning point. Not a battle, but a humiliation. The siege of Dyrrhachium turned into a catastrophe. All of Europe waited for news of the triumph of the new Crusade, but Bohemond's army ended up trapped on a hostile coast. Alexios applied scorched earth tactics against him. The Byzantine fleet blockaded Bohemond from the sea, cutting off supplies. The Byzantine army did not engage in open battle, but intercepted all his foraging parties. The great 34,000-strong army of Crusaders began to starve. Dysentery broke out in the camp. Instead of glory, Bohemond's warriors were dying from disease and hopelessness. Alexios did not storm them. He simply waited for the gigantic army of the Norman to rot alive. Let's analyze what happened. Bohemond, a genius of lightning-fast attacks and daring intrigues, proved helpless against tactics of strangulation. He was an adventurer, a gambler. Alexios acted as an emperor, playing the long game. By 1108, Bohemond realized he had lost completely. His army was on the verge of mutiny. He had no food and no avenues for retreat. He had to ask for peace. And Alexios arranged a demonstrative humiliation for him. He forced Bohemond to sign the Treaty of Devol. This document became Bohemond's political obituary. He didn't just acknowledge his defeat, he acknowledged himself a vassal of Emperor Alexios. He officially renounced all rights to Antioch, agreeing to rule it in the name of Byzantium. He agreed to a Greek patriarch in his city. The man who lost his inheritance because he didn't want to be second, who started a crusade to become first, ended by officially, on paper, acknowledging himself the servant of his worst enemy. He broke. Alexios let him go, but Bohemond could never bring himself to return to Antioch, which he now owned as a vassal of Byzantium. He returned to Italy and died there 3 years later in 1111, in obscurity. The great adventurer, son of Guiscard, died not as a prince, not as a conqueror, but as a defeated vassal of the Byzantine Empire. Bohemond was gone, broken and humiliated. But the history of his adventure did not end there. In Antioch, thousands of kilometers away, his nephew, Tancred, who had ruled the city all this time, received news of the Treaty of Devol, and he simply ignored it. He declared that Bohemond signed this treaty as a captive under duress, and that he, Tancred, would never recognize the authority of Byzantium. Alexios won the battle against Bohemond, but lost the war for Antioch. Bohemond's adventure, though it cost him his life and honor, was ultimately crowned with success. The principality which he gnawed out with his teeth from Byzantium and the Turks remained in the hands of his dynasty. He laid the foundation for the longest-lasting Crusader state and the most hostile to Byzantium. Bohemond of Taranto passed away in 1111 in Italy in obscurity. He died as a broken vassal of the Byzantine Empire, having signed the humiliating Treaty of Devol. But in Antioch, his nephew, Tancred, simply tore up this treaty. Bohemond's adventure, despite his personal collapse, was crowned with success. It was not just the capture of a city, it was a schism that predetermined the fate of the Crusades. And if Bohemond appeared as the adventurer who created a principality, then Godfrey's brother emerged as the figure who created the state. His name is Baldwin I, and his history is the true legend of the first king of Jerusalem. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Like if his cynicism amazed you. The story of Bohemond is an eternal debate about what is more important, motives or results. Was he a traitor to the idea of the Crusade, or was his pragmatism the only thing that allowed the Crusaders to hold on in the East? Write your opinion in the comments. Thanks for watching.